In me, but I definitely talk with my hands. A little bit about me. My name's Michelle Belanger. If you know my face and you watch TV and don't feel bad, because I don't so much, you may have seen me on Paranormal State. If there is a documentary on vampires, it's been filmed in the past 15 years. If I am not on it, I've been consulted on it. My stuff was researched in the CSI episode Suckers, when they did stuff about real vampires, and actually it was my writing that was the reason why the people who thought they were vampires weren't the murderers, which was kind of nice for a change. I've been on CNN Headline News, Reels, HBO in connection with True Blood, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I think the coolest one was when they shipped me off to Oslo to be on basically like their psychic Oprah. And hung with the Norwegians and talked psychic stuff out there with like the mother-in-law of the Norwegian princess, which I had no clue when I was talking with her, and she actually invited me back to the palace, and I totally like, well, I was like nope, too nervous, that's way too cool for me. Wow. I have been writing, well heck, you all are local. I went to Highland out here. I was writing as soon as they had like their young authors program. Like I was putting things out. Like I knew I wanted to be a writer. I had a lot of amazing supportive people, one of whom might be sitting in the back, and I won't call them out so that they don't get embarrassed. But definitely the people here, and especially the folks in Highland, helped to give me the skills and the confidence to do what I wanted to do with my life. I went to John Carroll. I've got a double degree, 19th century British literature and comparative religious studies, both of which are definitely coming together with this. I started off in fiction. I've got a bunch of awards that are so long ago now that they really don't count. But I found a niche in nonfiction. I've always been fascinated by the spooky and the macabre. I mean, I remember standing in Hinckley Elementary School arguing with Mrs. Schwaggart for my right to be able to read Edgar Allan Poe when I was in second grade, and that was for the older kids. So it's been a thing. So the nonfiction, if it goes bump in the night, I've probably written something about it. Currently the most popular book, and I expect it to continue, is The Dictionary of Demons, where I went digging through manuscripts in Latin, French, Italian, English, and a little bit of German, from between the 13th century and the 17th century, primarily Western Christian Europe, and just collated all of these different names of things that were identified as evil spirits, demons, fallen angels, and partly because of that background in comparative religious studies, give context for like our development of the belief in Western civilization in these things. I didn't want to take a theological stance one way or the other, but because of my work on Paranormal State, demons were a big thing people were talking about. So I wanted to put the research, the scholarly part of it into people's hands. And you can't immerse yourself in like that much like deep research. I mean, I was reading Latin manuscripts in German block print lettering, and not come out with like fun little like what ifs, at least me. Like I never lost the desire to tell stories and to tell fun stories. So let's see, the Dictionary of Demons came out in 2010, and it was 2008 where I first started kind of putting down the notes for what would become Conspiracy of Angels. I had gotten, I don't want to say bored, because there's still so much to write about nonfiction-wise, but a little not challenged. I think the publishing company I was working with, I would send in a manuscript, and like the Dictionary of Demons, they just tapped out. They're like, we have nobody who can read half the languages that you put into this, so we can't even like really give you editing anything. We can't even fact check you, which was a little frustrating to me, because I'm more a scholar than I am than I think of myself as like a pulp writer. So I wanted something that would really start to push my boundaries as a writer. And in college, I'd wussed out of pushing through the fiction markets because they are incredibly competitive. It is very difficult to get sold. It is political. There's so many weird ins and outs with it, and of course if it's fiction, you really absolutely need to have a literary agent. And as one friend who helped me get to the end point with Conspiracy of Angels had let me know, their New York Times best-selling series, which has been that sort of series for 20 years, she had received 300 rejection letters for her series when she was initially pitching it, and almost all of those rejections were citing the exact same stuff that her fans love it for. And her name is Laurel K. Hamilton. She does the Anita Blake Vampire series. 300 rejection letters. And when I was in college, I just did not have the wherewithal to slog through that. You know, it's impossible not to take personally at least a little bit. Especially when like you're in your 20s and you're like, well, I don't know if I'm good or not. And I just decided after the Dictionary of Demons that I was gonna finally try to like push my way through it again. It often felt like I was pressing my face against a cheese grater. This is the best and the worst time ever to be a writer, to get published. There are so many options now, but it also means that the market is absolutely flooded. And much like how music was changed radically with the digital age, not just piracy, but the way in which music can get sold to people now, the same thing is starting to happen to books, and has been happening to books. But the publishing industry is about as monolithic as the Catholic Church and is slow to change. And so trying to adapt to how they sell things and like their business model, it's in this weird shifting evolutionary change. So I just sort of dove into that and decided to go all the traditional route, found a wonderful agent, Lucienne Diver, who had happened to also see me on Paranormal State. And the weirdest thing was realizing that because at that point I was better known as someone on TV, most people didn't think that I could also be a writer. And I was like, that's what I started as. No, really, here, read the stuff. I'm not just like a talking head on TV. We went through a couple of different publishing companies, and I don't like being political about it, but I will say that the majority of rejection letters that we got seemed to think that because my name was a girl's name, I should be writing romance no matter how well I wrote action. And I didn't like that very much, and neither did my agent, so we just kept pushing until we found someone who actually got it, who didn't say, oh, hey, this is great, but how about, you know, somebody gets it on? Because my main character wakes up on the shores of Lake Erie. He's got one boot, his leather jacket, and pretty much his wallet for any clue of what the heck's going on in his life. The last thing he's going to think about is like chatting somebody up at a bar. You know, if this guy is like, you know, hey, nice boots, want to knock him, there's something seriously wrong with him with everything else that's going on in his world. So I absolutely did not want a publisher that was going to be like, you need to have sex in this book. I mean, I get sex sells, that's great, but it's not part of this story right now. Like it's the action, and I love film noir and detective novels and being able to write in that rather than just get pushed somewhere simply for something as superficial as my name. I was very fortunate that Lucienne kept at it, and we found Titan Books. And my fellow at Titan actually got the story. Like, he was the first person who read this and was able to, like, you know, talk about, like, hey, how about you change this? And, like, he got into the character's head, he got into my head, and he is the best editor ever. And it's delightful because right on his business cards, he is the dark editorial overlord. He apparently has a reputation of being fairly brutal with his edits. I didn't find him so. Like, I love his style. It is the perfect style for me. And his name is Steve Saffel. He is why the book is the absolute best that it can be. Like, you want a good editor if this is something you're going to do. That said, it's been a great, wild, wonderful adventure. I am working on very little sleep because I was just in Austin, Texas for the Austin Vampire Ball, where we did, the other cool thing about the publishing company is they actually let me have books for the event that was before, because today is officially the release day. This is the day that the book drops, and this is like a sacred day in the publishing industry. No one should have had copies before this. My publishing company was kind enough to make sure that since I was in Austin with, you know, several, I think it was probably 500-600 people, they let me be able to put books in people's hands. And that was really, really cool of them. So I can't speak highly enough about them. But why don't I do a little bit of reading from the book? My main character is Zach Westland. He doesn't know it at the beginning of the book. He figures it out within the first couple of pages. As I said, he wakes up on the shores of Lake Erie. He ends up hitchhiking he wakes up in Ashtabula, basically. He ends up getting picked up by this Big Bill, the semi-driver, who drops him off at basically a biker bar in East Ashtabula. And this is where I'm going to start us off. That's the other thing I really like about it. I had to not fight, but at least argue for the right to put it in Cleveland. I love this city. I love this whole area, like the entire Northeast Ohio region. I could live in New York, I could live in LA, I could live in Chicago, and New Orleans I love visiting, but I have to come back here. This is where my roots are, and I think it is vastly underrated by the rest of the country. This is not the Mistake on the Lake. It is not the city of the burning river. This is a city where Rockefeller, Edison, Eliot Ness, Langston Hughes lived here and wrote here. There are so many wonderful things. Bob Hope. If you track down Tom Hanks, there's so many talents that come from here. We have such a history. We've got the most amazing art museum. The collection rivals the Met, and it's free. You go to Chicago, you go to the Field Museum or something, you are shelling out to get to it. They might have one free date. No, because of the captains of industry, because of our history, we have this great support of the arts. And so trying to share some of my passion for this area as well. And finally Steve was like, oh, well, okay. And he spins it a little differently now, but end result, it's in Cleveland. And so there are going to be lots of places that you're like, hey, I know that place. I stood blinking in the harsh glare of the floodlights mounted on the roof of the single-story bar. The wide lot held 2 semis, half a dozen mud-spattered pickups, and a few bikes out front. A couple of neon signs in the windows let me know I could get fresh eats and cold beer, except the E in eats flickered dully, making the sign read fresh ats. I pondered the nature of a fresh at while I tried to figure out my next move. I had an address. It was safe to assume that's where I lived, but with no car and no shoes, the 60 miles to Cleveland might as well have been 6 million. Maybe I could use the phone and call a cab. Throwing my slightly less sodden leather jacket over my shoulder, I picked my way across the entrance of the pub, the gravel sharp and painful against the raw pads of my feet. The wind kicked up, scattering dried leaves across my path. If it was cold, I didn't feel it. From about 10 paces, I could hear the muffled strains of country music, and I drew up short when I spied a predictable sign on the door. No shirt, no shoes, no service. To which was appended in less regular red letters, no shit. Really not my fucking day. I sighed and then shook my head and went in anyway. The worst they could do was throw me out, right? I opened the door to a sensory assault. Fryer grease, cigarette smoke, stale sweat, and even staler beer. Half a dozen old TVs were mounted at various angles over the bar and seating area. The pictures flickered unsteadily, and not a single one held the same color balance. Loud country music blared from the speakers, completely drowning out anything coming over the TVs, and yet none of the TVs were on mute, adding a dull, insensible hum to the chaos. The bass of the speakers completely swallowed the treble, so what little I could hear of the lyrics came out garbled at best. Considering it was country, that was maybe a mercy. I flinched as for an instant it seemed as if the patrons of the bar were shouting all at once. There were about 10 of them, and the cacophony drowned even the din of the music and the TVs, then abruptly receded as I realized almost no one's mouth was moving. Most of the guys just sat morosely staring into their beers. The bartender looked up as I hesitated near the door. He was big, not as tall as I was, but broader again by half. I figured he had about 50 pounds on me, and little of that was fat. He had a hairnet beneath which a snowy sweep of ponytail started about halfway back on his scalp. Of all things, he had a beard net, too, covering a plume of white and gray, long enough to make a Tolkien dwarf envious. As he regarded me, his ice-chip eyes went 10 degrees chillier. "Sign's there for a reason," he grunted in a basso voice that cut easily through the noise. I was still trying to work out why I'd heard voices. Was I hallucinating? If I had shoes, I'd be wearing them, I shot back. "Look, I just need the payphone and change for a 20. I approached the bar, holding out one of my soggy bills. From the look of his stained and greasy apron, he was also the cook. He squinted down at the damp and crumpled money, then took in the whole of my appearance. "What the heck happened to you?" he grunted. I wish I knew, I thought, but I just shrugged. Out loud, I answered, "Bad day. I don't imagine cabs come all the way out here." He quirked an eyebrow at me. It was one of those old guy eyebrows where a couple of the hairs had gone wild and grew 3 times as long as any of the others. They stuck out from the middle like curling antennae. "From where? Cleveland?" I asked hopefully. A few of the patrons stole sideways glances at me and snorted over their beers. The bartender let out a bellowing laugh. "You're kidding, right?" It was worth a shot. That left me with the business card. Glossy black, it had heaven stamped on it in stylish silver lettering. The phone number and address were in red. I had no idea how or even if it pertained to me. At least there was a number I could call. There was somewhere to start. "Is there a hotel nearby?" I asked glumly, just in case heaven didn't pan out. "Roadway Express, about a mile the other side of town," he offered. "If you got their number, I'll take that too." Shaking his head, the bartender grabbed something bulky from under the register and chucked it. I caught the phone book with a speed and accuracy that surprised even me, snapping my left hand up and seeming to pluck the unwieldy tome from midair. I paused, staring at this. Half a dozen of the bar's patrons were staring now too. Whispers surged, threatening to swell into shouting again. I closed my eyes against the sensation fighting for order in my own head. Thanks, I muttered a little weakly. I tucked the phone book under one arm and did my best to look inconspicuous. At 6'3" and covered in lake muck, it wasn't happening. Still shaking his head and muttering to himself, the fellow counted out my change and set the money down on the bar. I scooped up the bills and quarters, pointedly avoiding touching his hand. Biker Santa jerked his thumb toward an alcove, which, according to the battered tin sign tacked above it, also led to the used beer department. "Phone's back there," he said, then abruptly turned around and ignored me. The payphone was clunky and ancient, but I hadn't expected anything less. In this age of ubiquitous cell phones, I was just happy the bar hadn't ripped the thing out and replaced it with some flashy gambling machine. It was dented on one side, some of the paint scraped down to the metal. I ran a finger over one of the dents curiously, then froze as I got that electric feeling again. Something blossomed in my mind, not just thoughts this time, but whole images. They came in rapid flashes like a stop-motion film, each scene super saturated with emotion. A man in a pale shirt and a cowboy hat pacing on the phone. This phone. A woman on the other end, and somehow I could see her too. She was seated on a couch with a hideous floral print, a box of tissues open on the coffee table before her. She had a black eye and raw bruises across her jaw and chin. There were scrapes on his knuckles from breaking 2 of her teeth. He rubbed the raw, infected skin while he argued. She was breaking up with him. He couldn't yell loud enough to berate her, wanted to hit her even then, but she was miles away. He had a thumper dangling from his belt, something shaped like a mini baseball bat used to test the tires on his truck. I couldn't say how, but I knew the nature of the little tool in an instant. Red in the face and raging, he grabbed the thumper and beat it repeatedly against the side of the phone. Then he was screaming into the receiver that she couldn't do this to him, that he would show her, he would make her pay. Through hiccuping sobs, she said, "No more." She wouldn't let him hurt her anymore. That was when she grabbed the gun sitting next to the box of tissues. When she closed her lips around the muzzle, the blast nearly drove me to my knees. With a hoarse cry, I tore my hand away from the side of the payphone. It felt like I was going to vomit again, and my pulse hammered painfully in my head. I tried to breathe through it, acutely aware of the field of eyes on my back. What the hell? Was this some kind of vision? If it was, what was I supposed to do with it? Run out and stop her? I didn't recognize either the woman or the man. Maybe it was something that had already happened. Yet it was so immediate, I could still taste the metal of the gun. Clenching my teeth against the echo of the gunshot, I tried to get a grip on myself. It wasn't anything I could do for anyone, not in my current state, even if what I'd just seen was real. I closed my eyes and counted my breaths until my heart resumed a steadier pace. I had to get my own shit sorted. Picking up the business end of the phone, I started feeding it quarters. With trembling fingers, I punched in the number for Club Heaven. I needed answers. With luck, they would be on the other end of the line. And that is how Zach figures that his life comes with a slightly more complicated instruction manual than the average person. Hey, I got through that and didn't stumble too much on 2 hours of sleep, so go me. I can talk at you a little bit more about ideas and concepts, but I really like conversation and dialogue. So if you guys want to ask questions and talk at me, and open the floor to anything. So go ahead, in the back.
I was wondering, given your time, like on paranormal state, when you're walking into somewhat negative, energetic spaces, what do you do to protect your energy?
Okay, there are a couple of techniques, and I got asked this when I was at the Vampire Club with like 800 people crammed shoulder to shoulder, which isn't even negative, it was just a lot of stuff to deal with. Just learning how to do events was challenging. My first thing was recognizing when I was getting overwhelmed. Like I get kind of ditzy, I can't concentrate, or I start like getting emotions, flashes, things that are coming from outside of me. The first trick was learning what was my inside voice and what was actually something coming from outside of me, that this was actually a thing that was happening. I have a couple of like physical techniques that I use. I run around in leather jackets a lot, but it's because when I was a teen, the first thing that I bought for myself with my own money was a leather jacket. And I'd go down to Parmatown Mall, and I would put it on like my armor and practice with that as a way of blocking out what I could pick up. So physical cues, like something that you can anchor your concentration to, because you can't sit there and imagine, picture walls around yourself all the time. It's mentally exhausting. I mean, you've probably heard other people who identify as psychics say, you need to shield. You find your center point and you imagine like a white light around you, walls around you. The symbolism really doesn't matter. It's more about having good boundaries and establishing those boundaries. When I get overwhelmed in a space, the main thing that I found is the best trick is, if it's something that I'm doing like business-wise, I scoot off to the bathroom. I can get a little bit of controlled space, close the door, run my hands under the water, have a very physical, tactile sensation to bring me back just to my body, and find that center again. And from that center, find my balance, and then go back into it if I have no choice but to deal with it. With really bad, yucky places, one of the better things, just remove yourself from the location. And then, again, find that center. It is totally a throwback to Die Hard, but if the weather is nice, take your shoes and socks off and make little fists with your toes in the grass. And physical, tactile things to pull you away from that not physical stuff, so that you have a clearer way of thinking about it. And those shields are very important. Again, the symbolism, not so important. White light, brick and mortar, fire, wind, it doesn't matter. Whatever is going to speak deeply to you, the most important thing is knowing that there is a boundary where you end and the rest of the world begins, and the ability to navigate that and keep the stuff that you don't want out.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that they gave us a little sample of your book on Overdrive, so I was reading it, and it said that you use a lot of your experience to write this book.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see visions as clearly as Zach does?
Yes, I am incredibly visual with it, to a point where it was the experiences on Paranormal State were the ones that absolutely convinced me that there was really something, not simply Sherlock going on, and it was one of the reasons that I'd agreed when friends asked me to be on it. I know that I am intuitive and insightful. I pick up a lot of details that people miss. on a very not metaphysical level. And for the longest time, I couldn't quite suss out where the line was. Putting a blindfold on and walking into a house that I've never been to before and having basically freaking Technicolor stuff roll through my head. The one that got me, I think, and this was pre-blindfold, is the episode called The Anniversary. It was a little house in Kentucky. And unbeknownst to even the folks who were investigating, 100 years to the day of that investigation, there had been a brutal rape and murder of a 12-year-old girl by her older, mentally challenged cousin. And a lot of craziness had ensued with that because he assaulted her in the woods behind the house. He choked her to death. He hadn't necessarily intended to kill her. He realized that he'd killed her. He came back. He hid stuff. He took his boots off. He hid them in places to show that they weren't muddy. Ultimately, when he was captured, they had to dress him up in women's clothes to move him from one prison to another because everybody wanted to lynch him. And I had this entire scene, something that it seemed like it belonged in a movie. And my job with that was to just say whatever came to mind. And enough years had gone through that I knew if you take time to second guess what's going through your head and analyze it, you're going to taint it. We've got all of these expectations, and once we start wrangling with it, so that intuitive flow, I just let all this stuff pour out of my head, head to mouth. Said it, came in, I had to fly out and go do some book-related thing, so I never knew whether I was right or wrong. I go back maybe 2 weeks later for something in, I think, Maryland, and the crew is acting real weird around me. Real weird. And, they never bothered to tell me, if it was right, wrong, or indifferent. So all I'm seeing is people are treating me like I'm going to bite them. And finally, Katrina Weidman, she's like, no, did nobody tell you? You nailed that. Oh my God. And she shows me the newspaper clippings that they pulled up. And I mean, it was the guy's face, it was the girl. One of the images that I'd gotten was, going into a wardrobe, putting these big, oversized, clunky, mud-caked shoes. I mean, probably size 13, 14, and shoving them in the back of a wardrobe. And that happened. And the family didn't know it had happened. The crew didn't know it had happened. The paranormal state, nobody. They were we had no one had a clue that was what was going on. And I'm I have no explanation. The rational side of me is where does it, how does it work? I'd love to be able to deconstruct it and figure it out. What I can say is it does work. The weird thing with the blindfold was it got to a point where I would walk into a place and I would have such a vivid image. I could tell you what the walls looked like. And I don't understand how that works. I would walk into this one place, and I immediately saw, the wood paneling, the color of the grain, the freaking taxidermy heads on the walls. And, if I went off of what my expectations of what the house should have looked like, I was expecting yet another rather, cookie-cutter suburban house, beige walls, whatever, a couple of pictures of the kids on the walls. I can't explain exactly why it works that way. And I will say that, unfortunately, because some people who are psychic are that incredibly visual, it means that a lot of other people don't realize that they are also sensitive. And that, honestly, I think it's a perfectly human, I don't think it's a special ability. I think everybody has it. I think it's actually so completely normal and ingrained in us that we don't think of it as extraordinary. It's only when we have it highlighted in extraordinary circumstances. Everybody's walked into a room where two people were arguing, and they're not arguing anymore, but you can still feel that tension on the air. Everybody's had, that one person where they meet and they just have that instant sense of nope, not going to trust that person. Or even that instant sense of connection of we totally click. I don't know anything about you, but you, I need to know you better. And that is psychic. It's just quieter. Those gut instincts. But yeah, incredibly visual, and I'm totally mining all of those experiences to put it into Zach, partly to contextualize those experiences. I'll be perfectly honest. One of the great things about fiction and storytelling is myth lets us take the parts of our world that we don't understand and tell ourselves stories about it that gives it meaning for us, that puts it into a shape that that we're no longer wrestling with, a shape that we can kind of take in. And definitely the work with first putting this together. I mean, the first notes for this were on set with Paranormal State. I was, where was it? Somewhere in California. They usually wouldn't, like, I'd be in some random hotel. Sometimes if it was close to state lines, it would be over state lines just to, like, give me false positives, because, to be fair, the production company didn't know how I was doing what I was doing. And it just got, like, progressively more, let's test this stuff. But yeah, that it started off, and I'm just, kind of sitting cooling my heels after doing my thing while the local Native American shaman is doing a blessing, because the family had ties with some tribal stuff, and so did the land. And so I'm like, my life is like somebody else's book. What would this be like if it was like a book? Let's write this book down and explore the things that never make it to the TV show, the stuff that is too weird, the stuff that you can't talk about on the internet because people are just going to think that you're crazy, and play around with it. It's definitely fiction, but the best fiction is built on the bones of fact, is built on our actual experiences.
When did you realize you had an extra sense? At what age?
The trick was realizing that other people didn't. My mom and her sisters, my grandmother, behind closed doors we talked about stuff like that. As early as 4, I saw, it was the first ghost that I know for sure that I'd seen, and I didn't know that she was a spirit at the time, was at the Hinckley Library, and I saw the Blue Lady at the Hinckley Library. They were still in the process of constructing, like turning the Stouffer house into the library in Hinckley. And my mom knew the librarian. I forget the librarian's name. I think they went to school together. And I was an early reader. So we're there. It's before my last heart surgery. So I know I'm somewhere between 4 and 4.5. Mom told me under no certain circumstances should I go past all of the tape with the stuff, because that was bad. So of course, the minute her back was turned, that's exactly what I did, because that's what you do when you're 4 and inquisitive. So I ended up like scooting over, going under the tape. I remember going upstairs and into a room, which was incredibly disappointing because there was nothing that seemed forbidden. It was actually mostly empty. There was like, evidence of painting and a ladder and some stuff and a tarp over on one side. Nothing else, and windows, and there's this woman standing at the window. And what struck me the most with her was all these tiny little buttons on these tight bits of her dress. And she had like these poofy sleeves, and they got tight here, and there were like all of these tiny buttons that went all the way up the back of the dress, and this high collar, and all her hair is up on top of her head. And I am thinking, how does she button all of those buttons? Like, that is what I am stuck on. And she doesn't say anything, and she acknowledges my presence. She turns and she looks at me. And if I had the word at the time, I would have said that she looked melancholy. And I don't know if this is me interpreting the memory or not, but when I pull the memory up, there's light coming in through that window, and she's not casting a shadow, but that doesn't seem strange. My mom calls for me, and I have that like stab of guilt of like I'm somewhere I shouldn't be. So there's only the one doorway in and out that I can see, and I kind of poke my head out into the hall and yell back, coming, and coming, Mom! And I turn back in, and the woman is gone. And with 4-year-old logic, I determined that clearly she shouldn't be in the room either, feels just as guilty as me, and has found the hiding space that I cannot see in this room. And so I think nothing more of her presence and just go off. And it was years later that I researched and found that other people had seen her and seen her in that dress. Because for me, the dress, it was white with these tiny blue embroidered flowers. In talking with what a lot of people probably know, anybody related to me knows, I was born with a ventricular septal defect. I was a very sick kid. I had open heart surgeries and wasn't expected to live past the age of 5. When I finally got old enough to ask my mom if I had had a near-death experience, And if I'd like actually clinically died, and she's like, "Which time, honey?" And I'm like, not necessarily the thing you want to hear, but and I have a lot of vivid memories from that time, possibly because of all the trauma. Like it really, like, I think people will go one of two ways with very traumatic stuff. They either completely suppress it, or it is like this it galvanizes the experiences. And I remember conversations about death and mortality and in life and things with my mom. I remember talking about being able to feel things from other people. It's not a ghost story. There was another girl in the hospital with me. I think it might have been the catheterization prior to this final surgery. The linear, like trying to come up with like a time frame with it. But she would wake up with these nightmares. And I would wake up because I picked up on the nightmare before she woke up yelling. What I recall was she was in there for observation because she had a seizure disorder, but they were trying to figure out if it was physical or not physical because the poor girl had watched her father shoot her mother with a shotgun and then blow his head off. And so she'd been through some trauma. And I remember feeling that pain. And what I would do is I would yank my IV out and basically pull myself out and crawl in bed with her and stroke her head until she fell back asleep, and made that pain go away because I could feel it too. And it never struck me until really going into kindergarten, first grade, and talking with other kids that this was not a normal experience, that other people weren't like that. And then when my grandmother was big on, this is real, but it's not something that you really talk about with other people because they're not going to understand. And actually, she had some real fears that the government would take me away, which, she was kind of quirky.
Yeah, but at that time, weren't they doing some experiments with remote viewing?
Well, the scariest darn thing ever was working with the Rhine Institute a couple of years ago, and when the guy at the Rhine Institute was like, "Well, why haven't you ever been tested?" And I'm like, "Well, this will sound strange, but my grandmother was afraid the government would take me away." And he's like, "Well, what year was that?" I'm like, "Well, 70s. Oh, yeah, that happened." Okay, that's cool. So conspiracy theory or not, I don't know, but yeah, I just had a weird childhood. Growing up here, finding out, I got to take parapsychology as when I was 10, between 4th grade and in 5th grade. The Highland School District had like these Saturday enrichment courses. They were the coolest thing ever because you could go to school on the weekend and take more classes. It was like there was all sorts of. I learned how to program computers on VIC-20s when you were still saving stuff on cassette tapes. And one of the teachers, and I don't think it was actually like Hinckley. I think it might have been Buckeye. It was her father-in-law. He had an accent from the British Isles and was part of the Society for Psychical Research. And so he taught parapsychology. We were doing, I remember our final thing was doing predictions about Reagan's election and whether or not Reagan would get elected. And we learned things about dowsing and pendulums, like shit that you would never learn in a public school now. Like, that would totally not be okay. But 10 and 11, we were able to have conversations about this, talk about how people studied it, talk about how people sometimes faked it, like, and I had a charmed life. I am exactly who I needed to be and had exactly all the things around me that I needed. And I look back at it and I kind of go, so really, if I was writing this as a book, my editor would be going, nobody would believe that. That's a little too heavy-handed. There's all sorts of Deus Ex Machina going on there. So 4.5, and then the one thing that was kind of frowned on is I learned by studying. Like, I need to read it, I need to research it. And the one attitude that was hard for me to parse growing up was having experiences was totally okay. Trying to study what it meant was seen as a cult. And I to this day, like, a couple of my relatives just won't even talk to me. My Uncle Bill, who, for me, growing up, he was my Uncle Superman. He looked like Christopher Reeve. He's the one who took me to Star Wars opening day. But he cut all ties. He would not even come out to my mom's funeral because I clearly am a Satanist for the things that I do. And so that weird disconnect of it's real, it can happen, but trying to study it is not okay. And I'm like, if it's real, I want to study it. I want to know what the heck is going on. I want to poke at it, prod at it, work out how to do, actual experiments with it. The Rhine Institute thing, by the way, was the coolest thing ever. They have got a piece of equipment that is ordinarily used in experiments for quantum mechanics. It measures individual photons of light. A thing that they know is the human body generates a small amount of light. Most of it is in the UV spectrum. And people who claim to be energy workers or martial artists, or we talk about it as energy. Well, they wanted to try to measure if it's energy. Is there a way to measure it as an actual output? And people who practice a whole host of different things are able to, in this experiment, go in, do their thing, and there's a measurable increase when they are trying to do like their healing, their Reiki, their yoga, their pranayama. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's clear that this whole conglomerate of things, there's something going on. We can say that people have some conscious control of this light that we all naturally emit, which tells me there's nifty stuff going on. What that nifty stuff means, and that's the other thing, is I like to separate the phenomenon from interpretation. Like, interpretation is where we develop our belief about it. I don't like to get into, what does it mean in terms of like, heaven, hell, damnation, redemption. That's each person's choice. I just want to know, okay, so what nuts and bolts, can we measure it? Is it actually going on? Is it just psychological? If it's more than psychological, how do we learn to make it better?
So would that be similar to like the chakras along that?
The idea of the chakras, the Hindu idea of the chakras and the nadi wheels, the channels and stuff, that is their way of contextualizing that body of light. And different cultures have different words for it, different ideas of it. In Taoism, the energy that we're talking about is called qi. In Hinduism, it's prana. Here in Western civilization, we kind of cut pretty much with the Age of Enlightenment, and when people got so very burnt out on some of the, frankly, draconian tactics of the church in the Middle Ages, and they cut a lot of that out as superstition, we lost words for it. We don't have words for it. All of our words are pillaged or, kind of like these linguistic placeholders. We call it energy, but, energy can be kinetic energy, it can be electricity, it can be a whole lot of things. It could be radiation, it can be electromagnetic. The research and experiments that I've had the privilege to participate in suggest to me that it's got more to do with things that will fall in an electromagnetic spectrum than in anything else. But also, what I've really learned is we don't understand the nature of that energy well enough yet to know exactly what equipment we would want to focus on it in order to get the most consistent measurements of
Find a way to define it.
Yeah, of how to define it. So we're still struggling to even have a word for it. But yeah, the chakras, in Taoism, it's the meridians. It is interesting with that idea of like centers that go down the center of the body, following the spine, and curiously mirroring the nervous system. You'll find that, and it was part of the impetus for the comparative religious studies degree, was going, okay, what do these people believe? And under those beliefs, what has been mythologized, what has been put into pretty language and turned into religion that is actually stuff that people have observed and experienced, and much like with doing this, then turned into myth because they didn't have a good way of defining it or understanding it.
I was curious about your writing process and how do you handle writer's block?
I didn't really have writer's block until My writing process has always been pretty lightning quick for ideas. George R. R. Martin kind of defined like the architect and the gardener. Like there's the person who sits there and plots everything out and has all of the structure laid out and just kind of plug and plays with characters and dialogue and everything. And I find that a little too restrictive for how much flow goes in. The gardener just kind of casts seeds and lets whatever the heck grows, which is how you've got, like, if you watch Game of Thrones, like, there's all this stuff going on, and you're never quite sure where things are going to go. Both of them have downsides for me. Like, there's not quite enough control with the gardener approach, and there's a little too much control, so I'm hybridized. So I usually have this flash of inspiration. Sometimes it's a full-on dream, like the whole dream is like vivid from start to finish, dialogue, characters, plot, and I come out with that, and I start to look at that from the framework of how you have to tell a story, because there's a certain type of architecture that goes into making a story. You have to have a beginning, a middle, and end, and there is very much a process that goes into each book. So I look at that flash of inspiration, and then I start to kind of plot out how would this fit in that architecture. In very broad strokes, I outline things, and so like Conspiracy of Angels, the Shadowside series, I've got a very big meta story, like this big story arc, and each trilogy is kind of a chapter in that story. So that requires a fair amount of planning. But at the same time, my characters come alive in my head. They are my own little creations, but they really do have conversations, and like they will wake me up at 3 in the morning, and Zach and Lil especially, I cannot shut those two up. So I like to leave a little bit of wiggle room for if they kind of veer off in a direction, because that gives it a more organic feel and a very more realistic feel. Trying to have like consistent, I use classical conditioning to keep myself consistent about writing. Writing in generally the same place. I've got my tea, it's the exact same tea, sit down with the tea, sit down with the same laptop, which I've been using for far too long, poor laptop. I've worn off most of the letters on the keys, and the poor thing is at this point just limping along. Same area. I've got a couple of candle scents that I'll keep. If I have writer's block, I fall back on those cues, on that structure to kind of like put myself in the headspace. The biggest challenge for me is I'm an introvert naturally, but I'm in an extrovert's profession on many levels. So I've got my writing time, but then I have to go out and talk to people, do events, do stuff on TV, and that is a completely different headspace for me. And I know some writers who can write when they're on the road, when they're traveling, who can, go out and, hobnob and knob the hobs, and then just go back to the hotel room and knock out 5,000 words. I cannot do that. I have to kind of cocoon at home and have my own space and have it very controlled, and just be there and writing or out here and talking, and the two just do not meet for me. Fortunately, I write really fast. I'm told like faster than is probably normal for most people. On a good day, I can do 10,000 words. But having transitioned from nonfiction to fiction, I have slowed down considerably because there are very subtle differences in how you put those kind of books together. In nonfiction, you've got your structure laid out. It's all facts. It's just a certain way that you tell, you pass your message along to somebody. With fiction, you're dealing with people. People are unpredictable. You have to think about messy things like emotions and relationships, and it's the language has to be much more immediate. Where for 15 years I trained myself to have that kind of like detached scholarly language, and you always use qualifications. When you're writing nonfiction, well, at least for me, the fact of the matter is nothing is ever absolute. And I like to make allowances for the fact that research is something that should always have an opening for further information. And so, I used, it seems to be this, or to allow for that. You have to be absolute. In fiction, it is, you don't want your characters to seem wishy-washy about, well, it seemed like I felt this way, and that doesn't make for punchy writing. The other thing with the Shadowside is, finding the voice of the series and the characters is sometimes surprising, because if you had asked me 10, 15 years ago what kind of novel I would have written, it would have been like this drippy, syrupy, lots of lace and velvet, very ornate language, very dense language. I love like Gothic and like the Romantics, the kind of stuff that Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak is based off of. And here I am writing like this terse, punchy, like Raymond Chandler kind of stuff that I never expected I'd be able to write. But getting into the character's head, this is totally Zach. My biggest problem with Zach is he is not very talkative. He's terse, and trying to get this character to like show anything that's going on inside of his head is like pulling teeth. So patterns, habits, that's how I get over writer's block. And writer's block is really tricky once you start getting into the editing stuff, because I've got a really strong inner editor voice, but if you're, and actually I find it a lot like doing psychic readings, as weird as it will sound, the creative flow is very intuitive. If you're thinking too hard about the nuts and bolts about it, you break yourself out of that, and then suddenly I will find myself rewriting the same sentence for like 58 times in the course of 30 minutes, at which point I realize I need to get up and go do something else.
You said that you were talking about your nonfiction books. When shall we expect maybe some more nonfiction?
I absolutely want to write nonfiction books that tie in the research that I did for Conspiracy of Angels, because all of the weird stuff is very grounded in things that I've dug through, old scripture and midrashes. These angels do play a part in this, but these are not your grandmother's angels. I've dug through like really like the roots of. So Christians got their angelology and their demonology from the Jews. The Jews got their demonology and their angelology from the Babylonians and Sumerians. And so digging back to those roots and like finding ways to like sort of explore the development of that through the lens of myth. But one way that I want to tie those two things in is to play in the realm of the fiction, but also show, well, here's the thing that I was researching, and here's what we know about like Sumerian demonology, and here's the stuff about the Watcher angels, and some stuff about Lilith, because Lil, there's some ties there. They might be a little obvious, they might not. I keep trying to write a nonfiction book to completion. These characters are so loud in my head, they will not let me rest. I got signed for the first 3 books, which is fairly standard. Basically my editor didn't edit the first book fast enough. I got bored, so I wrote a novella in between book 1 and book 2, like you do. And then, another novella between book 2 and book 3, which turned out to actually be the 3rd novella. And so, like, there's so much other writing beyond this when I find the time.
There's a question from Periscope about
Yes.
what the plans for the series are, which you've already started answering.
Okay, well, the plan for the series is I have a minimum of 12 books. I know that there will be tie-in stories with some of the characters. Like Lil, I expect people to want to see a story told from Lil's perspective. The thing is Lil as a character has so many spoilers for Zach's world that I'm going to have to wait several books in before I can show anything from her perspective. I'm looking forward to being able to crawl into her head. A couple of the other characters, like Teriel, who you'll meet. Teriel lives in the Cleveland Museum of Art. He is a spirit who's bound in a statue. And there is a short story from Teriel's perspective. He is the most challenging character to write because trying to come up with the psychology, like the the linguistic architecture of a being that doesn't have the perspective of a human body and has just sort of like been slowly swimming through time in a way that we don't quite understand. He's a really hard character to write, but I kind of want to play around. And his short story is actually a love story, which was sort of unexpected. There has been talk of graphic novels, depending on how this sells. There's also been talk of television series, which will be exciting, but having worked in television, I will be very picky about exactly how that may or may not come together. But all of that is down the line. It has everything to do with how well things do. The first couple of weeks of a book launch is sort of like the Nielsen ratings or opening weekend of a movie. So a lot of like what I will get to do with this will depend on how many pre-sales we had and how many people buy it within pretty much the next 2 to 4 weeks. We know that there will be 3 books minimum, and then if it takes off, there will be more than that. I'm hoping. I've gotten a lot of really good feedback. I hope everybody loves it as much as I love living in it. Like, just for me, it's great fun to play with. Any other questions over on Periscope? Type it out now.
Everybody just seems to want you to keep talking. One person said that nobody's eating in their house because they're not moving from where they're watching the Periscope.
Eat your vegetables, kids. Any other questions? I don't know what. I will just keep talking. But I also know that we're probably on a time schedule, and I don't know about all of the rest of you, but eventually I get antsy in the chairs.
Hey, Michelle, how do you juggle all your characters for the different series?
I have Post-it notes everywhere. My office at this point looks like somebody just went crazy, and they started out color-coded, but they're not color, because there's a point where I just like grab what everyone's hand is like, this detail that I have to remember. And it is mainly character details, like little things that come up in the book where you don't think about it ahead of time. Suddenly it comes out in conversation, and now you know somebody's birth date or like their favorite color or some little thing like that. Most writers who are writing a series create kind of a series Bible, which I also have, which is all of those details, so that every time that you're writing your books, you don't have to go back and reread everything and keep track of all those little details. And that's handy. As somebody who's got a gaming background, and since there are superpowers in the series, I will completely admit there are character sheets for everybody. Like I came up with the delineations of the abilities, because one of the things about working in a magical world, we'll think about it with cell phones and Waiting for Godot. You drop a cell phone into a lot of older stuff, and you've just wrecked the plot. And so any kind of ability, like Zach's ability to touch things and get images of it, Zach's ability to like literally walk into, because that's one thing he finds out that he can do. He doesn't just see it. Under certain circumstances, in places where very dramatic things have happened, he can step into that side of reality and physically interact with it. He can't stay there for very long, but coming up with the boundaries of those abilities. Because in urban fantasy particularly, nothing irritates me more than where a character's growth is equated with suddenly they've got phenomenal cosmic powers, and the plot, the only way to challenge the character is suddenly they're punching gods in the nose. And I wanted Zach's story to be much more about his coming to understand himself, coming to understand what does it mean to be human. And there's a lot of questions about how does your nature define you, and how can you choose a different path? He wakes up and his slate has been erased, tabula rasa. But as he goes along, we all are our own hero in our own story. I mean, that's kind of our default. So, of course, that's how he starts out. And as he goes on, things come out where he might not always have been the good guy in certain stuff. Like, he starts to see different conflicts from different perspectives. So the growth has less to do with his abilities, but being able to define those abilities from the get-go was very important. Because not defining them can put you at a point where you've just completely ruined your plot and painted yourself into a corner. And I've seen that in a couple of cases with writers, and I absolutely don't want to do that.
Got a question from Polina.
Yeah.
Asking where the characters originated from and how their personalities and traits developed. Cute question.
Zach started off as my inside voice. And I apologize because my inside voice has got language like a sailor. He's wry, he's a geek, but they're composites. Everybody tells you right from life, and while there's some merit to that, I think it's very gauche to just pick somebody up that you know in real life and just dump them in your fiction, like, wholesale. So everybody is a pastiche of things. Lil, I have no idea where she came from. Like, she is mouthy. She's this she's if Jessica Rabbit and Deadpool got together and had a baby. I mean, she's just she's a redheaded bombshell. She dances burlesque. She kills without remorse, and usually that's her default. She weaponizes people's expectations of her appearance. Like, as far as she's concerned, she's sexy, she knows it, and she completely uses that against people. She's very empowered. My biggest fear with Lil originally was that they were going to tell me to, like, just take the series and retell everything from her perspective. Echoes of things I've read before, observing people in the wild. Every once in a while I do have, and they will only ever be minor characters that are like a nod to somebody that I know, so there are Easter eggs and spoilers. Paulina will recognize there is a doorman at Club Heaven who has a goatee and kind of a shaved head, and he's wearing this leather top hat with steampunk goggles, and he's only there for like 2 lines, but Paulina will know who that is.
Yeah, she does.
Yeah, exactly. So there's little nods to things, and there's little nods to stuff from Paranormal State, and pretty much everything that I've done. So like just fun, and that's just fun to be like, Zach likes Battlestar Galactica, and has a Han Solo action figurine in his house, along with all of the pages from illuminated manuscripts. Some of stuff like Zach's apartment. I've got a friend down in Atlanta, Georgia, who is an antiques dealer, and when I got to stay at one of his apartments, he had pages from illuminated manuscripts just framed on the walls. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. Like, things from Psalteries, Books of Hours, stuff from the Celestial Hierarchy by Dionysius, the Pseudo-Areopagite, from, I think, the 14th, 15th century, which actually I completely stole and made a plot device, because that's a book that has the heavenly hierarchies of angels. And that turns into something that I totally yoinked. So there's little bits and pieces that I grab and weave into things, and then they become their own characters, and then they won't shut up in my head.
What about some of the other characters, Remy or Sal?
Remy, I've got a friend that has kind of been like Alfred to my Batman for many years, and there's a lot of shades of him and Remy. And it's not a one-for-one, it's not absolutely, but if you know that guy, you're going to be like, hey, that's that dude. Celerial was an interesting character to develop. Celerial is a trans woman, and I didn't realize that was going to be a political decision until Caitlyn Jenner happened. So Sal goes back to like the court of the Medici. Sal is an incredibly old, powerful vampire. And Sal is someone who, as I was putting that character together, I tried to imagine what it would be like to wear essentially the same skin for that long, to wear the same body for that long. And Sal's kind of innovative and experimental, and also a sensual being. And it seemed very natural to me that Sal would start to play with their physical appearance and experiment with like different ways to present that. And in a first draft with Sal, that started off as somebody who was like very much into body modification. There were like tattoos and piercings and just like the ability to play with the flesh because they heal very rapidly. And somewhere in the course of doing that, the people that Sal comes from, Zach's extended family, they're a brotherhood. Like as far as anybody knows, all of them are male. And that has a lot to do with the roots of our ideas of angels. They weren't, cute, fuzzy housewives hugging puppies like they kind of turned into with Victorian presentations of angels. There's a whole chapter in an Ethiopian Coptic text called the Mysteries of the Heavens and the Earth that is devoted to exactly how long the penis of an angel is. This is something that people thought about. Like this was a debate among theologians. And I integrated some of that all of them, they start off as male. And I'm like, well, if you've been like that for forever and you're someone who like maybe gets tired with how your body looks, why wouldn't you want to try something different? And suddenly Sal is a trans woman. Sal is someone who at this point, we've got the technology. So Sal has decided, hey, why not? And Sal is this weird mix appearance-wise of like Glenn Close and Tina Turner and RuPaul, and is really Machiavellian girders. And Sal's machinations, for me, are a bigger part of the character than the fact that Sal's experimental. But that character came from just sort of like that line of thinking of like, if you've been in the same body, the same skin for so long, what would you start to do with it? How bored would you get with it? How much would you want to start to play with how it looks on the outside?
Question from a writer's perspective. We, culturally, I think we've opted to live with turning to Google for our questions than actually spending the time to research them. And I know that you see on social media, people would rather comment on a headline than actually read the story, dive into it. So as that translates into fiction, you have people who I think sometimes read fiction looking for resonance or looking for a way to maybe gain truth through fiction, or looking for nonfiction conclusions through fiction. What is your end game as a writer with the series? Is there a conclusion you're trying to lead the readers toward? Is there, you mentioned earlier, like a lot of what you do is very speculative and like fun, you use that word, kind of playful. So is the end goal more of that fun, playful, speculative nature of the universe, or is there a truth or a conclusion you're leading people to?
Something I have observed and I'm going to go back to, there are two writers who've been very supportive with this process, who some people may know, they're Jim Butcher and Laurel K. Hamilton. And they work both, they are the names in urban fantasy. Like they've helped to define the genre. They're New York Times bestselling writers. Something I noticed with Jim Butcher is Harry Dresden is a wizard, and it's fun, it's fantasy, but Harry Dresden has a pentacle that he inherited from his mother, and the description of what that pentacle means, in a magical sense, of the elements circumscribed by human will, was the most eloquent description of what a pentacle means for any pagan currently practicing that I'd found in any book, fiction or nonfiction. And I'd watched people be inspired by. The thing about urban fantasy is verisimilitude is a very big part of it. Laurel K. Hamilton is like super into guns because of her character, because you have to learn, like, if you're going to write about how you shoot a gun, you better know how that actually works and what type of gun and what the recoil is like and how you clean it, because there are readers now who absolutely know that, and they will call you out on your bullshit if you just, like, make some stuff up. Back in the day, Bram Stoker could write about the Carpathian Mountains, having never been there, read, one travelogue and sat down and met with some dude. And so there's this, because we do live in a Google age, there is this pressure to make sure that there's as much reality in the fiction as possible. And one reason I like urban fantasy is that's part of it. Seeing that, integrating some of the paranormal and the supernatural, and it no longer is magic like the kind of stuff that you would see in like a 70s B-movie, where it's like, it's got nothing to do with anything but, shock value. the fact that it can inspire people to dig deeper, to then look for what the real stuff is. If I have a subtle machination of my own, that is absolutely part of it. Because I see so many people who have, well, I know it was a big scare that Harry Potter would turn kids to magic and witchcraft, but at the same time, fiction opens us up to possibility. I don't know that we would have this if we didn't have Star Trek. You know, we invent things that we see that we really want in the world. How many people were trying to create a hoverboard just because Back to the Future had a hoverboard? And there's this reciprocity of inspiration. The fiction writer draws from reality and meshes that with imagination and creates this edifice that is something of a mirror to our world and definitely goes in directions that do take flights of fancy. And I like to make it clear where it's definitely veering off into, like, you know, phenomenal cosmic power. Harry Dresden, in fact, you know, Fozane, you know, he does shoot fireballs from his fingertips. But, you know, the nuts and bolts of the ideas of how magic works in Jim Butcher's world is how it works. It's focused by human will. You use imagery to help yourself, like, give life and structure to the stuff that you're channeling. And treading those lines and finding the nifty way to, it comes down to myth for me. Myth making takes the truths and puts them in a shape that we can better contextualize them and then use them to inspire our own journey.
I'm sorry, just to follow up.
Go ahead.
So do you feel that responsibility as a writer then that you might be creating a pathway for somebody and not merely just, like you mentioned, a spirit being trapped in a statue, you know, where you might be causing people at home to start going, I wonder if my statue is infected with a spirit. You know, like, do you feel that burden where now you're planting seeds of thought that may or may not actually be encased in reality?
It is one of the reasons why I want to also do nonfiction stuff. And one thing that the Steve Sappel had suggested, I'm like, I'm already ahead of you on this, was doing like a series of blog posts of kind of like where those lines are, and, you know, where the idea came from. We've, you know, The Exorcist, Pazuzu, that idea of, like, you know, this strange haunted statue that comes from somewhere. There are cultural ideas for things inhabiting objects, and, you know, taking that and moving into fiction and exploring the idea. And so there's going to be this dialogue of, here's the fiction and it's fun and it's just go explore and, you know, have a grand time in the world. Here are these concepts. Where do these concepts come from? What are the roots of these ideas? How are they influencing us right now? I mean, angels and demons and spirits, psychic experiences. These are things that for some people are real, for some people are terrifying, and for some people are just always right across the board the stuff of fiction. I think every book we open is a portal to another world, is a portal to a realm of possibilities. In a world that is increasingly secularized, what I see is fandom often replaces, for many people who don't think of themselves as religious, the stuff that they become very fanatical about. You know, this is how you end up with Klingon weddings. Well, when you no longer have, like, when your old myths no longer fit, you look for the myths that do speak to you. And so for some people, that's Klingon weddings. At the end of the day, I do believe that people, by and large, have enough judgment to know how things apply to themselves and can be responsible with those. These are definitely not kids' books. I would not trust myself to write young adult. Like, there's a big push for young adult, and I don't think that I could write that to save my life. I've been asked to write it, and I like to explore things that are a little too deep, I think, for someone who's at that point in their life to really adequately navigate without adult supervision. And so, you know, it is also peppered with profanity, so hopefully parents will be like, Anything else, and do we want to take a little break? Because I wouldn't mind a quick little break to the bathroom myself.
Want to take a break?
Yeah, if we want to take a break, and then we can like kind of get to the actual signing of the stuff.
Take a 15-minute break.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
The second floor is also.
Yeah.